In August of 2016, a strange incident would unfold in Silvan, a small town in Australia, home to around 1,300 residents, about 30 miles to the east of Melbourne, Victoria. This was also the home to the Tromp family. Mark, who was 51 years old, his wife Jacoba, 53, and their 3 adult children, Brianna, 29, Mitchell, 25, and Ella, 22. The family can only be described as well respected and successful. Mark and Jacoba managed a red currant farm in addition to an earth-moving business. Their home was located on the farm, which housed the 2 of them and also accommodated 2 of their children. Their businesses, as far as I can tell, were completely family-run, and all 5 of them worked around the farm every day. On the 29th of August 2016, something would go awry. This family of 5 simply up and left, fleeing their home in a hurry without taking any belongings with them. For some reason, they left absolutely everything behind. Their bank cards, their phones, identification, and everything had just been left abandoned in disarray inside their home, and nobody knew why. It appeared as though they left in a mad panic without telling anyone where they might be going. That was only discovered the following day on the 30th, when through some reason, the local authorities had been called out to the family farm, following a report that Mark and Jacoba looked to have gone missing. When they arrived at the home, it appeared as though someone may have been inside frantically looking for something. But the findings inside the property weren't the only unusual aspect. Every car that was parked outside the home had the keys in the ignition, seemingly all ready to go at a moment's notice, except for Ella's, which was missing. Both of the doors to the house were left unlocked, and authorities just weren't sure what was going on. While the family's belongings were in disarray inside the home, there were no signs of a struggle. Local authorities believed that, rather than embarking on some kind of impromptu trip, the family likely fled in a state of total panic, though the reason for their sudden departure was not clear. To complicate matters as said, they had left behind all of their bank cards, phones and identification, making it difficult for the police to track them. Notably, although investigators recovered the phones that had been left in the house, Mitchell's phone wasn't among them. Needless to say, but this scene was obviously out of the ordinary and out of character for this family. Life on the farm, generally speaking, was thought to be rather calm, predictable and routine, which seemed to be outwardly known to everyone too. The farm wasn't just their source of income, it was something that the family held dear to them. However, something seemed to be bubbling within the family out of sight from the public. In the months leading up to this event, Mark had been privately displaying signs of anxiety and seemed to be withdrawn. He had been fueled with some kind of crippling dread that some force was watching them and was out to get them. He believed that he and the family were being targeted, though he didn't know how or who was doing it. But he just felt that something was deeply wrong, and over time, Jacoba began to share these fears alongside her husband. Brianna, Mitchell and Ella had been worried about their parents, but they first explained it away as stress. Perhaps they had just been working too much on the farm. They also had to manage a vast estate, so it's not unreasonable that it could have caused a bout of stress and anxiety. To the outside world, everything was fine. They were known to be a loving, close-knit family who were just actively involved in their farm. Outwardly, there was nothing to suggest that anything was wrong. The 3 siblings knew otherwise though, and tried to tell their parents that everything was okay. But their words of reassurance was falling on deaf ears. Things reached a boiling point on the 29th, the day before the authorities showed up to search the property. On that day, Mark had told his family that he believed that they were in grave danger and needed to leave immediately. Both he and Jacoba believed that they needed to act quickly as they were in imminent danger. The thought of abandoning their home and the farm out of the blue was confusing and terrifying to Brianna, Mitchell and Ella. But Mark's conviction was so strong that they thought that there really must be something to it. It seems that the initial plan, led by Mark, was to go to the airport and fly overseas. But close to the last minute, their minds had been changed. Mark felt that whoever was after them would have been able to track them via their passport usage and would come find them. Instead, the new plan was to drive somewhere off the grid. So, on that date, they got in Ella's SUV, left everything behind in a mad panic, and fled the home. Now, Mitchell had actually managed to bring his phone with him, and must have revealed it in the car around 22 miles or so into the drive, as Mark had him throw out the window, as he believed that it was going to be used to track them. It seems that Mitchell was the only one among them that hadn't been affected by the panic that had swept through the family. I am not sure if he thought that they were in danger at that moment, but he obviously was well aware that something had gone and was going terribly wrong with the family. This was a long drive too. They had driven from their home all the way around Bathurst, which is a town in New South Wales over 385 air miles away. They would have to have been driving for almost the entire day without stopping. Upon reaching Bathurst, Mitchell finally had enough and told them that he wanted to get out, which he did in the town. It seems that he had been growing frustrated at his family's actions and now had to set off on this massive trip back home without any means of transportation, without a phone, and with no money on his person. The rest of the family continued, and on this journey, they had been avoiding big towns by driving through the countryside roads. The family headed to the Jenolan Caves, which are located in the Blue Mountains region of New South Wales. It's not really clear as to why this location was chosen. It could have been a random stop, or they may have known about the caves beforehand. It seems like a very strange decision to have planned to hide out within the cave system. I'm not sure what the end goal might have been, since you couldn't feasibly stay in a cave or around it in a wilderness area for too long without a plan and without supplies. The Jenolan Caves themselves are considered among the oldest known cave systems in the world. They have always been considered culturally significant to the Indigenous Australian people, and they are associated with unusual stories and folklore. Something I did come across is very weirdly relevant and perhaps hugely coincidental here. I read something within their folklore that made me go cold as I was reading up on this case. The native people, within their folklore at least, say that some people are pulled or called to the cave, sometimes for protection and other times for more unsettling reasons. The Burra people believe that this was the work of spirits, and some people who were in danger would have dreams or visions compelling them to visit the caves for protection. Though it doesn't really say what they were supposed to be protected from, but they believed that these visions were a warning and that upon receiving them, one should get to the caves as soon as possible. Not nearly as ominous as that, but also in relation to this idea of being called or pulled to the cave. Elders of the group would on occasion supposedly feel as though the caves were beckoning to them, and apparently they said that they would receive visions or knowledge upon going deep enough into the caverns. The natives also spoke about being whispered to inside the caves, and weirdly, tourists have also reported something similar taking place to them. In addition, there are tales in the folklore of observing out of place, glowing, floating lights deep within the cave system. The natives believed them to be trickster spirits who would lure people deeper into the darkness with the sole purpose of causing them to become lost beyond hope of return. The natives also had fairly stern warnings about the caves too, stating that those who enter without proper respect or purpose are at risk of vanishing. You could argue that might have been a way to stop their young ones from irresponsibly entering the caves without any supervision. But they do say that those entering with arrogance or ill intent are at risk of being claimed by these spirits and going missing. On occasion, it seems that they also may have blamed the caves for causing their fellow clan members to vanish. There's not a lot you can really do with that information. It's just interesting that this folklore exists in the first place, and the family, who for some reason felt that they were in danger, went to these caves of all places. You also hear very similar types of folklore from all around the world. I do have a video about such things, which I'll leave a link to in the description below if you're interested. Anyway, moving back to the family. After arriving at the caves, it's not completely clear what the exact trigger was, but the atmosphere changed and now Ella and Rihanna were freaked out and ready to leave. They abruptly decided to part ways with their parents and got out of the cave area, likely just feeling deeply unsettled by what was going on and the erratic behaviour that was being displayed. During their getaway, the two sisters found a parked vehicle and managed to get inside and got it moving. I can only assume that there must have been a key left inside the vehicle, but even this wasn't without its oddities too. The pair of them drove to Goulburn in New South Wales, and when they arrived, they immediately notified the authorities about what was going on with their parents. The exact details of the conversation have never been released, and we only know that they reported their parents as missing persons. They said that they were worried about their well-being and that they were in the Jenolan Caves area. Shortly thereafter, for unknown reasons at a petrol station nearby, Rihanna started to display odd behaviour and wanted to part ways with her sister, though it's not clear why. But for one reason or another, she felt compelled to go off by herself. It's not known exactly what happened in the immediate aftermath, but for whatever reason, Rihanna fled into the wilderness. In the meantime, this report of the parents being missing is what prompted the police to go and visit the family home in Silvan. After losing track of her sister, Ella, now without a phone or any resources, decided that she needed to get home. So with the car that she and Rihanna had essentially stolen, she drove for 7 hours all the way back to the farm. Upon her arrival, the police were still inside the family home and they spoke further about everything that had happened. She was questioned in great detail and cooperated, but she found it incredibly difficult to comprehend what had even happened. Her memory of the ordeal was said to be somewhat scattered and vague, and she was just confused. She explained to them that her parents felt that something was wrong and that they were terrified that someone was out to get them. Mitchell hadn't arrived home yet. For him, with no money or access to his phone, he'd somehow had to take trains all over the place and managed to get back home the following morning on the 31st. The police were hoping that the pair of them could explain to them what precisely had happened after some rest. But again, they didn't really have any answers to give. They didn't understand what had transpired or what caused this to happen in the first place. As for Rihanna, she vanished without a trace for 2 days, and it's really not clear at all what happened to her during that time. She must have been wandering in the bush around the Goulburn area. On the 1st of September, 2 days after she disappeared, she had somehow managed to sneak into the back of a man's utility vehicle. As this local, whose name is Keith, was driving, he was unaware that Rihanna was in the back, but at some point he started to feel pressure on the back of his seat. When he turned around, he saw Rihanna, who was described as being distressed and practically catatonic, laid out across the back seats. Keith made this discovery around the Goulburn airport, and he had no idea for how long she'd been in the vehicle, where she'd gotten in, or how. Upon realising the kind of state that Rihanna was in, he called the authorities and she remained motionless, just staring into space until the police arrived. Rihanna had no memory of the last few days. She was in a state of dehydration and didn't know her name, where she was, or what was happening. The responding officers then took her to the Goulburn Hospital, where she found herself in the psychiatric ward for treatment. It seems like she was very fortunate to have come across someone like Keith, as that is a situation that could have gone very badly wrong if she'd have come across the wrong type of person. Thankfully though, she received treatment for stress-related illness. When she was ready to be questioned, like Ella and Mitchell, she found it difficult to put the situation into words. She just didn't know why she was as scared as she was, and why her parents had become so concerned all of a sudden. She just said that there was an increasing fear that they were the focus of an unknown danger and had to get away. Now, at this point, Mark and Jacoba were still missing. With the information the authorities were given about Jenolan Caves, that was the first place that was intensely searched, but there was no sign of them anywhere. There was no evidence of their presence within the cave system, and search teams combed through the area's thick wilderness around the caves unsuccessfully, and the couple seemed to have vanished from the area, but the authorities couldn't be entirely sure of that. The foliage was thick with dense forestry and steep cliffs. There were deep gorges all over the place, and this would have been a fairly dangerous search to undertake. In reality, Mark and Jacoba were not actually in the caves, nor were they in the surrounding wilderness area. Instead, they had driven around 270 miles to the southwest to a town called Wangaratta. Once they were there, for some reason, like the sisters, they split up. For some reason, Jacoba decided to use public transport and began to travel back north in the direction of the caves. It's not clear if her intention was actually to reach the Jenolan Caves for a second time in the end, but she made it to the town of Yass. While there, she tried to check into a motel, but she didn't have her phone or any money on her. She was then spotted wandering the streets in an agitated and confused manner. I'm not sure how exactly, but then she was taken to the Goulburn Hospital, where she received treatment for fatigue and the psychological distress that she was experiencing. Jacoba, like the others, once she was questioned, also found it very difficult to explain what had happened. She couldn't explain precisely what had caused the entire ordeal to have taken place. Her memory was also fragmented, and she could not remember the entire time she'd spent missing. She recalled being disoriented out in the wilderness, and then later losing Mark somehow. At approximately 10 PM on the 31st of August, Mark had allegedly been driving somewhat recklessly and was accused of tailgating a couple in a dangerous manner back in Wangaratta. The description of the vehicle given to the police matched Ella's missing Peugeot SUV, the one that Mark had been driving. They said that he'd been following so closely behind for so long that they felt it was best if they pulled over, hoping that the driver would just continue on their way. Instead, Mark pulled over too and appeared to be angry and agitated in the middle of the road, staring at them. Then, Mark turned around and ran into the nearby Mariwa Park, here, which backs into a forest. After watching this, the couple called the police. When the officers arrived, first they scanned the car and realised that the key had been left in the ignition. The officers went into the park and searched it, but Mark was just nowhere to be seen. Search dogs were then brought in, but they just couldn't find a scent anywhere, and there was nothing for them to follow. On the 3rd of September, around 5:50 PM, which was now almost a week after the family had initially fled their home, Mark was found by a passerby who happened to be walking along the road next to the Wangaratta airport. This person explained that Mark appeared to be distressed and was in a confused, dazed-like state. The police came and took Mark to the local police station, where he was questioned for around 5 hours and received a mental health assessment. He was then released into the care of his brother, who also happened to be a police officer. The Australian public had also been absolutely captivated by this incident, and the press was hungry for information. So, once everyone was safe and accounted for, Mitchell and Ella gave an interview the day after Mark was released from police custody. While they thanked the police and the public for everything they'd done and getting the information out there, they still had very little to offer in terms of an explanation for what had happened. Even after sitting on the event for a few days now, they were still just as perplexed as everyone listening to the incident from the outside. They could just not describe exactly how the events unfolded and came to pass. The lead officer of this incident said that in all his 30 years on the job, this was the strangest case that he'd ever encountered. There was an investigation in trying to understand the basis for the strange event. The finances of the family's businesses were examined, but they didn't find any kind of debt or anything that might have caused such an episode. They hadn't received any loans or anything like that from unsavoury sources, and they never found any evidence of any kind of threats being made to the family, which of course was relevant to establish because Mark and Jacoba thoroughly ended up believing that they were in danger. The idea that the family may have been taking certain substances that might cause such paranoia was also questioned, but there was no evidence of such substance abuse. The next idea that was examined was, well, if not purposefully taking such things, could they have been exposed to something like this while living together on the farm? If chemicals had leaked somehow, or there was just otherwise some exposure to this, then it would be easy to explain how the entire family was affected. This was taken seriously, and investigators did go to the site to look for any evidence that would suggest that this was the case, but they never found anything. This included checking for carbon monoxide in the house. The final hypothesis, which seems to be the most likely, is a psychological condition that is known by a number of names. Some like to call it folie à deux. I prefer shared madness, and as the DSM-5 used to call it, shared psychotic disorder. If you've seen my video on the Uber 5 disappearance, which I'll leave a link to in the description below, you'll have heard me talk about this before. But I think that the boys in the Uber 5 case and this family actually experienced something very similar. Of course, for those that know the Uber 5 case well, things turned out and ended much worse than they did here. But the underlying principles of this condition seem to apply to both incidents. As I also pointed out in my video covering the Uber 5, it's important to note that this is extremely rare to occur in groups of more than 2 people, but I do think it fits well here. Let's get a brief understanding of what this is. Shared psychotic disorder is a rare disorder characterized by sharing a specific delusion among 2 or more people in a close relationship. The inducer, who has a psychotic disorder with delusions, influences another individual or more based on a delusional belief. It is commonly seen among 2 individuals, but in rare cases can include larger groups. This disorder used to be thought of in isolation, but since the DSM-5 released in 2013, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders Handbook, used by professional healthcare providers, this disorder is now included within the schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. A completely hypothetical example of this taking place would be to imagine 2 brothers that are living in isolation away from others. One of the siblings develops a delusion that they're being targeted by some kind of secretive organisation or group. Perhaps they feel they're being watched, stalked, and feeling like they're in danger. The other sibling, through close association and influence of his brother, might also begin to believe in these delusional ideas, despite having no evidence of it whatsoever, and having no prior psychiatric problems. This shared madness might lead both of the siblings to take irrational and dangerous actions based on these delusions, such as, perhaps, running away into a dark and cold forest to get away from their perceived threat, as is seemingly what happened in the Uber 5 disappearance. In this case, while it is not well understood how an episode like this actually begins in the first place, Mark would very likely have been the inducer. After Mark began to suffer from these delusional beliefs about being the target of someone unknown to them, Jacoba's close proximity to Mark and constant exposure to these ideas seemed to have rubbed off on her, and then she was completely on board with it. The success of these ideas spreading in this manner seemed to correlate with a person's view of the inducer. So, if you're very close to the person experiencing this, hold them in high regard, believe that they are highly trustworthy, and overall have a good relationship with them, then one would be more at risk of taking on these ideas and beliefs themselves. I'd imagine that's because the inducer obviously has no idea that they are experiencing such a delusion. To them, it's very real and their behaviour reflects this. So the person this gets passed on to, they can see that the inducer is not acting, but instead is being truthful and is legitimately scared, worried, and experiencing a very real sense of dread. After these ideas or delusional beliefs spread to Jacoba, the sheer panic and dread that they would have been experiencing in the build-up to this incident again will have been very real. Next you have Mitchell, Rihanna and Ella, who became exposed to the shared madness, as now there were 2 people who fully believed in what was happening. Having one person you think very highly of experiencing such things is one thing, but having 2 people you feel that way about? It's clear to see how this kind of shared madness can quickly spread and get out of control. Mitchell was fortunate enough to have snapped out of it as quickly as he did, but for the rest of them, Rihanna particularly, alongside her parents, it seemed to have gripped her quite intensely, while Ella was also able to escape it. In the Uber 5 case, one of the lead investigators expressed his sheer incredulity at their disappearance, saying how none of it really made any sense without invoking some kind of foul play or threat that must have been made. There is a similar situation here too. As the lead investigator said, the case was the strangest and most bizarre he'd seen in his 30-year career. Then they went on to investigate finances and to see if any credible threats had been made, which they had not, because a true, real threat may have explained the whole thing. So, as appears to be the case, the threat could have and seemed to be entirely imagined by just one, Mark, and then everyone else, starting with Jacoba. That very much seems to be the case. Eventually, the police investigation came to an end, and I believe the official conclusion was this idea of a shared psychological disorder. Ella and Rihanna had been charged for stealing the vehicle near Jenolan Caves, but this was thankfully dropped later on given the circumstances, though it took until March of 2017 for Ella. Mentally, the aftermath will also have been fairly difficult to deal with after going through an incident like that. The family will have had to come to terms with the fact that their fears ultimately were unwarranted and everyone was put in danger as a result of them. Though it wasn't really anyone's fault, you don't get a say in it when this kind of psychological disorder overcomes you. The last words I could really find about this were that the family returned to their regular lives and were tending the farm, and I can only hope that they have made peace with what happened and are in a better place now. That brings us to the end of this. I do hope you found this one interesting. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you enjoyed this video, please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't like it, then feel free to give me a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys. Peace.